So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kathryn McEachern. She's a research plant ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey at the Channel Islands Field Station. I've really enjoyed working with Kathryn over the years. She has this really soothing Southern accent that goes with just her really steady personality and strong work ethic. And she's done so much to understand the island's rare plants over the past 3 decades. And she'll tell us about this work to understand and recover rare plants on the Channel Islands National Park, as well as more recent efforts to restore island oaks and ecosystems through the ambitious Cloud Forest Restoration Program. Welcome, Kathryn.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. It's been great knowing you all these decades as well. I have had the great good fortune to have most of my career span the transition on the islands from ranching to conservation, and it's been an extremely exciting time to be involved in restoration, conservation. This is one of the only places in the world where now the disturbances are being taken away, the stressors are being taken off of the ecosystem, and we can actually peel back the layers, as Peter was mentioning, and see what exists now that the stresses are gone. One of my roles as a research scientist in the National Park Service and in the U.S. Geological Survey and in the Department of Interior is to provide information that helps managers make decisions, helps them know what they have and what decisions that they can make from management, and also to look at the consequences of those management actions. And so this all started in 1993 when I was a fresh young graduate student. We convened a workshop with the local botanists, many of whom were here and hopefully watching as well on the YouTube, to just find out who are these rare plants, what are the rare plants of the islands, based on perception of their rarity and or their potential facing demise at the hands of some of the ranching practices. We ended up identifying about 80 plants of concern on the California National Park Service islands, the 5 islands of the National Park Service. 14 of those ended up eventually becoming listed as federally endangered or threatened. So my research approach over the years has been sounds pretty simple. I just framed up 4 questions that I've pursued all these years that many of you have helped me with. Where are the rare plant taxa? How do they compare to how they were doing in the past? How are populations doing now? And are there major threats to populations that we can do something about? The way I went about doing this is to look at herbarium archives to find out where they've been in the past, conduct field surveys to try and find them in the field and find them in new and old habitats, go back and count populations repeatedly, for some of them to do demographic monitoring to see what the weak links in the life cycle might be, and then to do some experiments to see what can we do, if anything, to help these plants out. And one way that I've come to think about this that I've found very useful as a framework for my work is to think about the plants as they are now and the plants as we want to have them in the future. So now and in the past, before the animals were moved, most of these rare plants were in few populations, small populations, widely isolated from one another and declining. And of course, the future we want for them is for them to be the opposite of that, many, large, connected, and growing. Through the years of collaboration with many of you and doing these research projects, we've been able to identify some of the things that I think of as constraints. There's something that's preventing these species from recovering, from moving from few and small and isolated to many, large and growing. And so I've begun to think of the approach to ways we might look at what we can do to recover plants as figuring out what the constraints are and then addressing recovery tools directly to those constraints so that we are focusing our few dollars and our limited energy efforts to those problems. And in thinking about the recovery tools that we have in our toolbox that we're all beginning to use or have been using for quite a while now, the biggest constraint of all was animal herbivory and trampling. And so before anything else could be done, it was pretty clear to me as a researcher looking at rare plants that the animal eradication was paramount to being able to do anything else. And for that, I'm forever grateful to all of you who've worked to do this. So my career, my last 3 decades, and some of this talk is about some of the stories that the plants are telling us about how they're experiencing this transition. There's stories of passive recovery. There's stories that some are saying we're still small and isolated. There are altered habitats that are changing at different rates. Climate change, kind of the elephant in the room here, is a factor for many of them, and lost ecosystem functions are part of the story as well. There are very many plants, like we've been hearing in the last talks, that have just experienced passive recovery. That is, they've expanded, grown in number, expanded their footprint on the landscape enormously just simply because the animals were moving. I say simply, and I'm sure it wasn't a simple thing to do, but the Torrey pines are a great example of that. As Denise said, they are a single island endemic pine that were reduced in number to about 100 individuals on Santa Rosa Island in about 1888. Several years ago, we had a CSU Channel Islands student group count the pines and measure them, and there were more than 3,000 adult pines. And if you start to count the seedlings and saplings, there are more than 1,200 or 12,000 of them out there right now. So they are expanding their footprint on the islands enormously without animals eating them and stepping on them. Another group of plants that we've been able to study with some funding from the National Biological Survey, the USGS, and the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden with colleague Dieter Wilken, was a survey we did of about 50 of these 80 identified species that lived in canyons on Santa Rosa Island. And what we found as a result of an NSF grant that we had that allowed us to resurvey those canyons in 2010, 2011, was that many of them were just moving out of the refugium habitats where they had been hiding back into the canyons. And so we had an enormous increase in numbers of species and a huge increase in abundance. And the footprint of these plants is still expanding on the landscape. A great consequence of taking the animals off the islands. There are a couple of other plants that we have out there that have been recovering as well, and this is such a cool thing. These two plants, the Santa Cruz Island bedstraw and the Dudleya Santa Cruz Island live forever, have been proposed for delisting now by the Fish and Wildlife Service because they've been expanding. The Galium, the bedstraw, is moving off of the cliff faces where it had survived during the ranching areas back onto the terraces, and the Dudleya is expanding itself out on Santa Cruz Island in the one population that it inhabits. Kate Faulkner mentioned the inventory monitoring program of the Park Service. We can see through the data that have been collected over the years there that there have been some incredibly good changes in some of the areas on San Miguel Island. Like, for example, a giant Coreopsis stand has come to inhabit an area that in 1983 was a grassland. These are what the inventory monitoring data are showing us, and it just shows us again a passive recovery that is happening out there. But it's not always the case that passive recovery, that expansion on its own is happening. And what we're finding through the monitoring that the inventory monitoring program is doing, through studies that we are all doing, this remapping and resurveying, is that there's some places that are resistant to change, especially where there are annual grasslands that are really holding firm onto the ground. Patricia Corey did her Ph.D. thesis looking at the data from San Miguel and Santa Barbara Island and found that grasslands on clayey soils are much more resistant to invasion or recovery of native shrubs than grasslands, for example, on sandy soils, and even on the same island. So what we know is that there are nuanced differences depending on where the plants are, who they are, and what they are experiencing. I think, though, without having kept the pieces, like Peter was saying, we really wouldn't be seeing any of this. We still have some plants that exist in populations that are very small and isolated, and we're beginning to focus a lot on those right now with some recent funding from the state, from Fish and Wildlife Service, from USGS, and from the Park Service. Some of those are annual plants that live out their entire life cycle in 1 year. They exist as seeds in the seed bank in favorable years. Hopefully this is going to be one of them. They'll spring up, grow, flower, produce seeds, and die back before the summer drought hits. And so they have a very quick life cycle. Several of these are listed plants, and they're high on our list of targeted plants to work with this coming few years. And we can address quite a few of the issues with these plants. Another group of them are perennials, shrubs, and some of the live forevers. They live a much longer life cycle. They also are, though, in very few and small populations far between. The island barberry that you see on the left, we know from about 6 populations and now from about 11 locations on Santa Cruz Island. It used to be on 2 other islands as well. The plant in the middle The island bushmallow is only on Santa Cruz Island. The Trask live forever is only on Santa Barbara Island. The two shrubs are very interesting, make a very interesting comparison for some of the challenges that we have for recovery. The barberry and the Malacothamus, the bushmallow, we've tried to reproduce from cuttings. The bushmallow does great. It's very happy to be grown from cuttings in the nursery and then planted out. The barberry, on the other hand, is a very slow-growing plant that we are really is difficult to plant from cuttings. And so now TNC is sponsoring a project to grow it from tissue culture. So we try various things, and they don't work, we try more. The Live Forever is a success story that has been really largely led by our colleagues at CIES, the California Institute of Environmental Studies, out on Santa Barbara Island. They have greatly increased the number of Live Forevers on that island by growing them from seed in an island nursery. Another kind of nuanced situation that illustrates some of the challenges that we as researchers and that the plants as native endemic plants have is illustrated by this Castanea, the soft-leaved island paintbrush. It's an interesting plant to talk to little kids about because it's sort of parasitic. It's called hemiparasitic. It makes root connections with native shrubs and then draws sugars and nutrients and minerals from the roots of those shrubs. Kind of a, sort of a sick life cycle. But what it means is that they need to be close to these native shrubs. One of the problems that this plant has had is that during the ranching era, there was a lot of space that opened up because of trampling by the animals that we called fragmentation of habitats. And so there are vast places, meters wide, between where these plants germinate and where the next nearest shrub is, so they can't find their neighbor that they need to grow. Another thing that we observe in long-term demographic monitoring plots that I'm doing with my colleague Diane Thompson at the Claremont McKenna Colleges, we started looking at individual plants in plots in 1995 and tracked plants and stems in those plots annually since then. And what we found was that when the animals were eradicated, when the cattle were removed from Santa Rosa Island and the deer and elk started to be reduced, there was a big increase in population in the numbers of stems and in the numbers of plants. And that persisted for several years, but then started to decline. And about the point when it started to decline, we lost funding, and it was kind of like, ooh, we still have to do this. So somehow we scraped together the money to keep this going. And what we found was that the decline was related to increasing nighttime temperatures. As temperatures increased, the smaller stems and twigs and plants started to experience mortality. And so we see in our population there's kind of an effect here of changing temperature. We don't know if it's the temperature itself or if there's something that's related to the temperature, like perhaps the movement of fog more offshore or more inland. We've continued this until the current year, and this decline, sadly, is continuing. So this kind of points out that we, as managers and as researchers, need to think ahead strategically about how we're going to think about climate change and what it does with plants like this. And I think by studying some of these rare plants, we're also able to make some conjectures and prescriptions for the more common ones. I think what we're left with here is we can't do much about the climate, but we certainly can address habitat situations. We can protect the habitat, keep it from becoming more fragmented, protect it and let it grow back in together. So just a few stories about the rare plants, various types of responses across the landscape. One of the plants that really stands out in many people's minds is the island oak, Quercus tomentella. This plant, as Luciana was showing, grows in a very foggy ecosystem, and the functions of that ecosystem have basically been lost. What happens on Santa Rosa Island and in many coastal areas, Guadalupe Island and others, is that the fog rolls in as the sun sets at night, drenches the landscape, just blows across the landscape and drenches the landscape with water. There used to be plants there that had their twigs and leaves sticking up into the air, collecting that water. The water would condense on it, and then it would drop down and percolate into the ground. Now, as you can see from this photograph taken by my colleague in USGS, Lorraine Flint, the water condenses on the trees that are remaining, these island oaks that are stranded here on this hillside, but it runs down, and does not percolate into the ground. And what we see here was a place where there used to be chaparral covering the hills with the island oak and with the bishop pines and other plants growing in woodland, kind of like groves coming out of this chaparral. It's hard to kind of wrap your mind about, but if you think about the hills here around Santa Barbara, you see their chaparral covered, and that should be the case here as well. So really, we're talking about an ecosystem function that has been lost to the island. We need to capture water in the uplands so that we can get water that percolates into the ground, feeds the springs and seeps, the stream-flowing groundwater, so that we, again, can have a hydrologic function that works. So this project, the Cloud Forest Restoration Project, is about helping the oaks, but it's also about restoring a function that has been absolutely lost from this system. So I know that many of you here have helped with this project, and we've involved about 400 volunteers now, students, retirees, which I'm going to be one soon someday, teachers, much appreciated because you can't do this by yourself. But basically our objectives here are to slow erosion, to trap organic matter as it blows by on the hills, to harvest fog, to increase soil water, grow plants, and figure out what happens. And so one thing that we do is that we hand roll wattles, like the kinds that you can see along the highway when they do roadside construction, place them along the hill slopes to collect sediment, to collect seeds, to collect detritus. We also put in what we call zigzag fences that are about 9-inch tall fences that we've put under the trees to collect all the leaves and sticks and insects, lichens that were blowing by. We have constructed what we're calling fog fences. These are 1-inch galvanized steel mesh fences that we put close to the ground because otherwise they'd blow away out there on Santa Rosa Island, which is very windy. The wind pushes through the fence, the water condenses, the fog-laden water condenses on the fence, and the water sheets down onto the ground and waters our plants for us. We also grow plants in the nursery that we plant out there. Here you can see a very happy bunch of bishop pine seeds, and we're growing island oaks in the nursery. We plant them out along these fog fences, supplemented with drip irrigation just the first growing season to get them started. And then once the plants get as tall as the fence, we remove the fences and we let the plants take over the business of catching the water for themselves. And we're using a concept here that's kind of common in deserts, and you hear a lot in ecology classes that we have nurse plants. And so the idea is to plant several plants close together, one of which can get tall, and then other plants can come in below it into that fog drip zone. And we are starting to see that happening up there, which is such a joyful recovery thing to see. We also do a lot of research to figure out what's happening. Are we actually getting water into the ground? Are we actually trapping sediment? And does it have any effect on erosion? And so this is what we've done to date. We had a 3-year grant from the National Park Service, had a bit of a hiatus, which kind of coincided with the pandemic, but we now have another 3 years of funding to continue this work. So that's what we're working on now. Like I said, we've had tons of volunteers of all walks of life, and I really appreciate all the help out there. So what my take-home message from this is that the animal removal has been essential and has benefited a lot of plants and benefited the ecosystem, but the recovery varies across species and across places on the islands. I think that it's really important for us to collect information on what's going on so that we can target our actions very carefully to the problems. Like Peter, I think we should save the pieces, because if there are no pieces left, we have nothing to work with. And be patient. It takes quite a long time for these projects to work. Thanks to many of the collaborators and major funders that we've had through these years, I really appreciate it and appreciate what's yet to come. I think I ran a bit over time.
You're doing good. Let's take one question.
One question?
All right, one burning question.
Burning question. Foggy question.
We can move on too. You can think about it, write them down on your little note card. Oh, awesome.
I've got a question about the role of erosion and how significant it is. It was one of the factors that you listed there, but throughout our whole region with such erosive soils, and how much is the control of erosion related to success in these kinds of projects?
So the question was, how much is the control of erosion related to this success?
Yeah, I agree with you that it's a very widespread phenomenon in the kinds of geology that we have around here, and I think it is paramount. If you don't control erosion, you can't allow plants to get purchased, you can't grow a seed bed, the litter and detritus that's needed for a seed to fall down and be nourished by moisture and nutrients. So you have to start from the ground up. Certainly, and you know, it's kind of funny here, I'm a botanist, but I'm in the U.S. Geological Survey, so it's good to have kind of a geological question.